I've got here, during the war, of course, when the Marines were here, as youngsters, we picked up thousands of cartridge cases and sold them as scrap brass. The other item there is the tail fin of a mortar bomb, of which they fired thousands and thousands up here in what is now Queen Elizabeth Park. And once again, we gathered those as scrap metal. And I can remember so often if we were here for term or Christmas holidays, when our dad went back into Wellington to work on a Monday morning, we would give him the sacks, and next Friday night when he came out, the first question was, "Dad, how much did you get for the scrap brass?" Because then my sisters and myself and our cousins all had to share the money for the scrap brass. But we have wonderful memories. The Marines were all around us. I mean, what is now Queen Elizabeth Park was Norm Mackenzie's farm, which had been commandeered together with Evans's farm up near Mackay's Crossing. Virtually all the land from Paekakariki to Raumati South had been commandeered for the camps and for a training ground. So we had constant gunfire. We had Marines in jeeps and half-track armoured cars and tanks. And our first memory, I'm sure Pam will reinforce this, of the tanks is sitting to dinner one night and hearing a rumbling sound. And our dad said, "If I wasn't mistaken, that's tanks." And our first experience was they had a 4-man light tank, which they had lots of in New Zealand here. And the tanks were virtually just over our back fence on Mackenzie's farm doing manoeuvres. So over the next year or two, we saw lots and lots of these tanks and the half-track armoured cars. In fact, the roads in Raumati South were largely chewed up in all that time, because when a track vehicle goes around, the inner track is stopped as the means of steering. So every time they went round a corner with one track stopped, one Caterpillar track stopped and the other one driving, imagine what it did to the roads. So the roads were constantly chewed up, as was all the farmland of Mackenzie's farm, now Queen Elizabeth Park, and we got used to this. But the gentleman earlier talked about the generosity of them. As youngsters, when they were out in the hills on manoeuvres, and we got close to them, they would so often give us a 10-shilling note or something and say, "Laddie, or kids, can you go and buy me some ice cream?" So we would buy some ice creams. The other thing, one of the shops in Raumati South run by a Mrs. Mitchell, and she made big chunks of fruitcake and chopped it up. And the Americans got to love Mrs. Mitchell's fruitcake. And they would say to us, "Go and get some ice creams and get some of that fruitcake, will you?"
And cheese.
The Chesdale and Pixie cheese they loved.
Much cheese as they could get.
And when we came back and then gave them the change, they would say, "No, you keep the change." And I remember on more than one occasion going home and saying to Mum, "Gee, Hank the Yank gave me..." "You take that right back," she'd say. So we'd have to traipse back over the paddocks, find where they were on manoeuvres, if we could still find them, find the guy who'd given it to us. And on occasions we couldn't find him, so we would come back home. And I think Mum accepted the fact then that if you couldn't find the guy, you couldn't give him. But they were very generous. Every time we had one home for a meal, they would always bring, as someone said, candy bars, packets of cigarettes. Our dad smoked. We were all given a Marine's badge at one stage.
No, we weren't.
Oh, most of us were. That's my Marine. I was given a Marine's badge.
Well, we had a lot of these gorgeous young Marines up for meals. Our mother was very generous. We were 4 children. The eldest sister turned 15 the year they came, so our parents tried to keep an eye on her because they didn't really want her to go off and not come home. And so they kept a strict eye on her, and she knew when she had to come back. She did come up in a jeep once. She came in an ambulance.
She came in an ambulance.
An ambulance once
a Marine
up the
ambulance,
drive
that's right.
with a Marine. But we were at the beach house all of the war as much as we could, because our father fought in the trenches in the First World War, and we lived out near the airport in Wellington and near the entrance to Wellington Harbour, and he had such horrendous memories of that First World War. He said, "I'm going to get my family out of this vulnerable area." The Japanese had already bombed Darwin, and he built a gas producer, or bought a gas producer and put it on our Chevrolet car. So we went out nearly every weekend putting coal in it, declinkering at all the little lay-bys, so we got out of Wellington. And one of the Marines who was leaving to go to one of the islands gave my mother 4 badges for us 4 children, and as I was the youngest, and we had first cousins next door, she said, Oh, I think Pam's too small. Give it to Margaret, the eldest cousin next door, and I've never got over it. I rang my eldest sister in Auckland and said, I'm going to Salute 70. I need the Marine badge that you've got. And she said, where's yours? And I said, Mum gave it to Margaret. Anyway, my eldest sister couldn't find hers. But one of the exciting things was, not long after they'd started their manoeuvres, suddenly one of the locals yelled out, the tanks rolled in the frog pond. So we all tore down the back of our section. That was terribly exciting, wasn't it?
Yeah, there was a tank on its side
pond.
with the crew still inside.
Yes.
Yeah. And the crew clambered out. They would be knocked around. 2 of them were bleeding quite badly. And they got on the radio and they called up Camp Mackay or Camp Russell, and they sent a bulldozer up the beach, which came out of where the sandhills were very different in Raumati South in those days, and the tank was able to climb up onto Poplar Avenue, or the Esplanade, and come over. And I think all of Raumati South was watching while they got hawsers out, pulled the tank up onto its tracks, but it was still in the pond, and then pulled it out, and the crew climbed out through the turret. And I remember some rather bleeding crew members, but all was well. But just one of those. Another lovely memory of ours is going up Waterfall Valley, just between here and Poplar Avenue, off the main road. We used to go for lovely picnics up into the bush in Waterfall Gully there, and coming down one day and striking a group of Marines who were setting up a communication post, with a man with headphones and a radio and a big aerial up, or setting up a mortar bomb situation, setting up a machine gun post. And this was part of an observation exercise. And I think we said to them, gosh, you're pretty hidden away there. Yeah, they said no one's allowed to see us. Further down, as we got close to the state highway, the level crossing, which is now closed off, we struck a group of Marines, and they said to us, they were walking up, they said, hey, have you seen any military activity? I said, yep, a few hundred metres up. A few hundred metres up, and makes the marker on the right, you'll find a guy with he set up a communication, he's sitting there with his headphones on and a big aerial up, and I said, a few hundred metres further up, there's a guy set up a machine gun post. Oh, great. But we went home, and I never found out who got the best marks that day. I think we let the side down.
We had cousins that stayed with at my grandmother's house next door, and our 2 mothers, we walked miles and miles. We'd walk up to Paraparam, way up the Valley Road for picnics, picking blackberries, up Waterfall Gully. But one of the favourites was going down the beach to the Whareroa stream. And we can both tell the story. But this day we were going down, and we always had a enamel mug on a string over our shoulder and the pan to build a fire and cook sausages. And we passed a dirty bit of sacking hanging on a stick at some stage, we could all remember later, but we go down to the Whareroa stream and we set out the picnic, and the mothers start getting lunch, and we're all swimming and floating on logs on the stream, and suddenly...
There's trace of machine gun fire going over our heads.
Over the top. Wow. Next thing, there's a Marine shouting and screaming at the mothers, what the hell are you doing here? We got a live fire.
You're in the firing range.
You're in a firing range, ladies, and there's 8 little children. Get the hell out. Didn't you pass the red flag?
Yeah. I said we passed a sack dipped in red paint. That's a red flag. That means you're in the firing range.
So we went out of the stream with our heads
I've never
down.
been to another picnic with machine gun fire going over my head.
Going ping!
Yeah, that's...
We thought all our Christmases had come at once.
Oh, it was a wonderful, wonderful experience.
But we had so many young Marines into our home, and they were always just over the fence. My little 7 or 8 year old cousin and I we were just playing up the top of the hill, and 2 Marines in their camouflage came over to us, gave us a terrible fright, but there they were, big smiles on their faces. Will you fill our water bottles, and will you go and buy us an ice cream, please? But one of the things I'd like to say was, after the Marines went to Tara, we lived in Wellington and got the evening post at night. I was still quite little, and one night my mother read the paper, and I can still see her with tears running down her face. Now, mothers didn't cry, did they? And I looked up and I said, Mummy, why are you crying? And she just looked at me and she said, so many of the boys have been killed. And I didn't understand. He was my brother, he was the boy. And I said, what do you mean? She said, the Marines have been killed at Tarawa. And I still looked at her and I said, but they're not your boys. And she said, but we got to know them so well, darling. And then she said, they're only 18. And it didn't mean anything to me until my elder son turned 18 and we were sitting around our dinner table, my husband and I and our lovely family, and I looked at my husband and I looked at this lovely young 18-year-old and I said, now I know what my mother cried. So you boys know just what it was like.
They sure left